Welcome to Truth Behind History, and let me start with a quick question that sounds almost insulting until we examine it carefully. When you picture a Neanderthal hunt, do you imagine raw strength, chaos, and luck, like survival was basically a long wrestling match with nature? That stereotype is everywhere, and it quietly smuggles in a bigger claim that Neanderthals were less strategic, less thoughtful, maybe even less intelligent than us. Here is the promise for today. By the end, you will understand why a lot of what gets called smart hunting is really smart economics, meaning careful choices about risk, reward, and limited resources, made in a world where mistakes had immediate consequences. And we are not going to do this with vibes or flattering stories. We are going to do it with what can actually be tested. The first step is simply separating myth from evidence. The myth says Neanderthals survived by brute strength, that they were basically close-range brawlers who stumbled through the Ice Age. The evidence, though, is made of patterns, and patterns can be evaluated. So what can we test? We can look at prey choice, not just what animals were eaten, but what that suggests about decision-making. We can look at transport decisions, meaning what parts of an animal were brought back to a living site and what was left behind, which tells us about planning and cost. We can look at diet signals, including chemical traces that help reconstruct broad dietary tendencies. We can look at tool investment, meaning whether they spent time and effort building reliable gear that pays off later. And to do that, we rely on different types of clues. Bones can show cut marks, breakage patterns, and which animals were processed. Chemical signals, like isotope patterns in remains, can inform broad dietary position in the food web, though we always interpret that carefully. Tools and wear patterns can hint at how implements were used and maintained. Residues can sometimes tell us what materials were involved, again with caution. None of this gives us a diary entry that says, "Dear Journal, today I optimized my risk-adjusted returns." But when multiple lines of evidence point in the same direction, the brute strength story starts to look lazy. So on this slide, I want you to hold one idea in your mind. Instead of asking whether Neanderthals were strong, assume they were, and ask the more revealing question. What choices did they make, again and again, that left behind a consistent footprint of planning, efficiency, and constraint management? That is where the myth begins to crack, and where the real story begins. Ice Age Europe was not a stable background stage where the same predictable routine worked year after year. It was a volatile setting where the rules changed with the seasons and sometimes changed unexpectedly. Picture a landscape that can be woodland in one region, open steppe in another, and rugged mountains in between, with animals migrating, weather shifting, and resources showing up in patches rather than evenly spread across the map. In that world, survival is not just about having muscles or courage. It is about managing constraints. And the list of constraints is not romantic, it is practical. Calories matter because you cannot think, travel, or recover without them. Time matters because daylight is limited, seasons are limited, and a day spent searching is a day you cannot spend doing something else. Risk matters because an injury is not an inconvenience, it can be catastrophic, and even a small mistake carries a real cost. Weather matters because it can shut down travel, change animal movement, and make shelter and warmth suddenly urgent. And there are human constraints too, like caring for others, coordinating with a group, and making decisions that keep everyone functioning rather than just one heroic individual. So when I say economies here, I do not mean coins or markets in the modern sense. I mean the deeper idea that scarcity forces trade-offs. Every choice is an allocation problem under uncertainty. Do we spend effort traveling farther for a better chance at food, or stay closer and accept smaller returns? Do we take a dangerous option with a big payoff, or a safer option that is more reliable? Do we commit time to a certain place or remain flexible? Even without writing, without formal institutions, and without numbers on paper, this is still economic behavior because it is decision-making under constraints with consequences. And that is the key shift in perspective. Once you see Ice Age life as a constant allocation problem, the question stops being, were Neanderthals tough, and becomes, how did they manage a moving landscape of limits, risks, and opportunities, using the information they had right in front of them? Imagine you wake up in a world where there is no pantry, no store, no steady paycheck of calories arriving on schedule. Your entire week depends on choices you make with a limited supply of something far more precious than money, which is time. Time is the currency on this slide, because everything you do costs hours. Traveling to a hunting area costs hours. Tracking costs hours. Waiting costs hours. A hunt itself costs hours. Then there is processing, which means cutting, breaking, carrying, drying, cooking, and storing, and all of that costs hours too. And you cannot buy more hours. Daylight ends. Weather changes. Seasons close the window. So time is not just a background detail, it is the structure of the budget. Energy is the other side of the budget. When you put in effort, you spend calories, and when you succeed, you gain calories. But the important part is net return, what you have left after the costs. A huge animal can look like a jackpot, but if it takes massive effort, creates serious danger, or forces you to waste time, the net return can shrink fast. And now we arrive at the third part, the part most people forget. Failure is expensive. A failed hunt is not just a day without food. It is a day of lost time and lost energy, and it increases future risk because now you have fewer reserves and fewer options. So in this budget, the worst outcome is not simply no reward. The worst outcome is wasting scarce time and energy while also making tomorrow harder. That is why a smart hunting often means something that sounds almost boring. It can mean reducing variance. It can mean choosing strategies that are less dramatic but more reliable, because reliability is a form of wealth when you live on the edge of scarcity. And this is where you should start thinking like a careful planner. If you face two options, one that is safe but smaller, and one that is risky but larger, the choice is not only about maximizing payoff. It is about managing the cost of failure. It is about the difference between a stable plan and a gamble. And once you see that, the Ice Age stops looking like a series of heroic scenes and starts looking like something much more interesting. It looks like a living spreadsheet made of bodies, weather, tools, and decisions, where every day you try to balance effort, danger, and reward in a way that keeps your group alive. When people picture Stone Age technology, they often imagine something improvised, like a sharp rock picked up and tossed away. But this slide is asking you to see tools the way an economist or an engineer would see them, as capital investment. Capital is any tool or system where you spend effort now so that you get better returns later. In a survival setting, the return can be reliability, efficiency, and safety. A well-made cutting tool, a carefully shaped point, or a prepared piece of equipment is not just an object. It is stored labor. It is hours of work and knowledge packed into something you can carry into the future. And once you think that way, one of the most important ideas here is composite technology, meaning combining multiple materials into one working system. Take hafting, where a stone point becomes part of a spear or similar tool by attaching it to a shaft. That single change can transform a tool from a fragile one-time implement into something more stable, more controllable, and potentially more reusable. It can also reduce waste, because you can replace parts rather than starting from scratch each time. Then there is the question of adhesives, like birch tar, used to bind parts together. Archaeologists have found evidence that Neandertals used birch tar at certain sites, and it is tempting to jump straight from that to a grand claim about complex cognition. The more careful view is this. Producing and using adhesives still shows practical know-how and repeatable method, because you are controlling materials to solve a specific problem, which is creating a dependable bond. At the same time, researchers debate how complicated the production process must have been in every case, and some work suggests that certain methods could be achieved without the elaborate setups people once assumed. So the honest conclusion is not a cartoon version of either side. It is that Neanderthal technology often looks like the economics of reliability. You invest effort into making the hunt less uncertain. You raise the chance that a tool works when you need it. You reduce the frequency of catastrophic failure. And in a world where time and energy are a tight budget, reliability is not a luxury. Reliability is an advantage that can decide whether a plan holds together. When we talk about prey choice, it is easy to reduce it to a simple question like, could they kill it? But this slide is saying that is the wrong question. The more revealing question is, was it worth it? Because every animal represents a bundle of trade-offs, and those trade-offs show up in the archaeological record. Think of a hunt like a calculation you do with your body instead of a calculator. You weigh the payoff, meaning how much usable food and material you might get, against the costs, like effort, danger, time, and the chance of going home with nothing. A very large animal can offer a huge potential return, but it also tends to come with higher risk and more work to handle, and in a world where failure is expensive, that matters. One of the ways researchers look for strategy is through something called mortality profiles, which is a careful way of saying what ages of animals are represented in the remains. If the pattern looks random, it might suggest opportunism. If the pattern looks selective, like particular age ranges show up repeatedly, that can suggest deliberate targeting, because hunters are not just taking whatever they bump into, they are choosing. And this is where the phrase smart hunting starts to mean something specific. It does not have to mean some dramatic genius moment. It can mean consistently making choices that raise net returns, meaning what you get after you subtract the costs of danger and handling time. There is also a helpful modeling lens called optimal foraging theory, and I want to be clear about what that is and what it is not. It is not a claim that Neanderthals were consciously doing math in their heads. It is a framework that helps us ask, if you had limited time and energy, which choices would tend to pay off, and would the evidence match that logic? Under this lens, prey choice is shaped by return rates, by risk, and by how long it takes to pursue, capture, and process an animal. So when you see repeated patterns in prey remains, researchers can ask whether those patterns look like the outcome of strategies that balance payoff and danger rather than pure chance. A site like Abric Romani is often discussed because it offers a sequence where these patterns can be studied over time, and it helps illustrate how scientists try to move from bones to behavior without making wild leaps. Still, we should keep one honest caution in mind. The same pattern can sometimes have more than one explanation, because environment, availability, and site use can all shape what ends up preserved. So the intellectually clean takeaway on this slide is this: prey choice is not just about survival in a vague sense. It is a window into decision-making under constraint, where planning can show up in the quiet, repeatable logic of choosing targets that make sense when you consider payoff, handling, and risk. Now that we have thought about prey choice in terms of payoff and trade-offs, there is another very practical layer that shows up clearly in the evidence, which is transport. A kill site is not a pantry. It is a moment in space and time where a lot of value suddenly exists, but it is not automatically usable unless you can process it and move it. So the question becomes, what do you do with a large animal after it is down? Do you butcher it on the spot and carry only selected portions? Do you attempt to carry most of the carcass back to a living site? Or do you do something in between, taking what is highest value and leaving behind what is heavy, low return, or not worth the time? And this is where economics becomes almost visible. Distance matters, terrain matters, and time matters, because carrying weight is not just tiring, it is costly. It costs energy, it costs speed, it raises exposure to weather, and it increases the risk of injury. And it also has an opportunity cost, because every hour spent hauling a heavy load is an hour not spent scouting, not spent repairing tools, not spent caring for others, not spent securing shelter. So you should imagine a constant set of trade-offs that would feel very immediate. Do we take the whole animal and accept the risk and the time, or do we take the best parts and move efficiently? This is why archaeologists pay close attention to which parts of animals appear at a camp. If you repeatedly find a pattern where certain high-utility parts show up more often than heavy low-utility parts, it can suggest selective transport, which is a fancy way of saying they were making cost-minimizing choices under real constraints. And notice what is happening here. This is not a story about heroic hunting alone. It is also a story about logistics. It is about planning the chain from kill to calories. You can think of it as a simple rule of thumb that many people have experienced in modern life too. If something is bulky, heavy, and low value, you do not carry it far unless you have a very good reason. In an Ice Age setting, that logic becomes a survival advantage. So on this slide, the key takeaway is that transport decisions leave an economic signature. They tell us about planning under scarcity. They tell us that the hunt did not end at the kill. The hunt continued through the choices of what to cut, what to carry, what to prioritize, and how to manage the cost of getting value back to the place where life actually happens. If you want to understand why cooperation matters so much in this kind of world, you have to think about variance, meaning how unpredictable outcomes can be. Big game hunting can bring a huge payoff, but it also brings huge uncertainty, because the risk of failure is real and the cost of failure is high. So here is the economic twist. A group can use cooperation as a way to reduce the danger of that uncertainty. Shared labor can make difficult tasks more manageable, and shared food can smooth out the ups and downs when one person or one small party comes back empty-handed. In other words, cooperation can function like insurance, not in a modern paperwork sense, but as a practical system where the group absorbs shocks that would be devastating to an individual. Think about it. If you hunt alone and fail, you personally pay the full price. If you hunt within a network where food and effort are shared, the same failure can become survivable. That changes incentives too. It can make it rational to attempt higher payoff strategies at times, because the downside is buffered by the group. It can also encourage specialization, where some people focus on certain tasks while others focus on different ones, because the return is not locked inside one person's hands. Now, how do archaeologists even begin to see something as social as cooperation? One cautious window comes from the movement of materials across distance. When we find stone materials like obsidian far from their geological source, it suggests either long-range travel, or exchange through contact between groups, or repeated interactions across a wider landscape. Researchers have used patterns like obsidian transfer distances to explore how hunter-gatherer networks might have been maintained over large areas in the late Pleistocene, and while we should not overclaim what that proves, it does support the idea that some groups were not isolated bubbles. They were connected, and connection itself can be a survival strategy. So the core message of this slide is simple but powerful. In a world where luck can flip your week upside down, cooperation is not just kindness. It is a mechanism for managing risk, stabilizing life, and turning a harsh environment into something you can navigate with other people instead of against it. This slide is about a balance that is easy to misunderstand if we turn it into a slogan. On one hand, a lot of evidence suggests that many Neanderthals in many contexts relied heavily on animal foods, and stable isotope research often places them high on the food web, which is consistent with a strong emphasis on meat and other animal resources. On the other hand, that does not automatically mean they ate the same thing everywhere or that they ignored other foods when conditions demanded flexibility. The more careful view is that diet reflects both environment and choices. If you live in a region and season where large herbivores are abundant, then relying heavily on them can be a rational strategy with strong returns. But if conditions shift, or if certain resources become unreliable, flexibility becomes valuable. And here is where the economic implication matters. Flexible input sourcing reduces starvation risk when one resource fails. It is the same logic as not relying on a single supplier in a fragile system. Some evidence for flexibility comes from dental calculus, which is hardened plaque that can trap microscopic traces of what people consumed or chewed. At El Sidron, for example, dental calculus work has been discussed as evidence that at least some Neanderthals consumed plant foods, including cooked plant material, and that they interacted with certain plants that may have had medicinal properties. That does not mean every Neanderthal was a broad-spectrum forager all the time, and researchers debate details, but it does support the idea that at least some individuals and groups were not locked into a single rigid diet. The honest takeaway here is that Neanderthal diets likely combined strong reliance on animal foods in many settings with a capacity for opportunistic or strategic flexibility depending on local conditions. And if you connect that back to our economic framing, flexibility is not a lifestyle preference, it is a risk management tool. The more ways you can convert a landscape into calories, the less likely you are to collapse when a single resource becomes scarce. What makes this slide fascinating is that it pushes us to expand what we mean by the word institution. Most people hear that word and picture a courthouse, a tax office, or a law book, but in a small Ice Age community, institutions are often invisible. They are the informal rules that shape behavior without being written down. Who gets access to a shared fire? How food is distributed after a hunt? What obligations exist when someone is injured? What counts as fair contribution? What counts as taking advantage? These rules matter because they coordinate people, and coordination is a survival technology. If sharing norms are stable, then people can plan. If obligations are clear, then cooperation becomes less risky. If trust is protected, then the group can function as a unit rather than as a room full of competitors. And this is where local knowledge becomes a kind of wealth. Knowing which valley holds game in a certain season, which routes are safest in bad weather, which materials make better tools, which plants are edible or useful, these are not random trivia facts. They are decision-making advantages, and they only work when they are embedded in a social system where knowledge is transmitted and respected. Now, we should be honest about uncertainty. Archaeology cannot hand us a neat list of Neanderthal rules. But what it can show is that survival in harsh conditions strongly rewards stable norms, reciprocity, and responsibility, because without them, every problem becomes harder and every risk becomes bigger. So the point of this slide is not that Neanderthals had courts or bureaucracies. The point is that you can have institutions without centralized command, and those institutions can be deeply moral in practice, because they revolve around trust, fairness, and the reality that your choices affect other people who are trying to survive right beside you. Let us run a thought experiment, not because we think Neanderthals had modern states, but because the basic allocation problem shows up anywhere resources are scarce and information is scattered. Imagine two different ways a group could organize decisions about where to go, what to target, and how to respond when conditions shift. In the first, decisions are made locally, meaning the people closest to the ground are adjusting based on immediate feedback. They notice tracks, weather changes, animal movement, and tool wear, and they adapt quickly because the information arrives right where the decision happens. This creates a loop where choices get corrected fast, because reality answers back immediately. In the second, decisions are made through a centralized plan, meaning a small set of decision makers tries to direct others using a simplified picture of what is happening across a wide area. The problem is not that the decision makers are evil or stupid. The problem is that knowledge is dispersed. Conditions change faster than reports can travel, and the most important details are often local, temporary, and hard to summarize. When a plan misses those details, the people executing it face the consequences on the ground. This is where incentives quietly shape outcomes. Ask yourself 3 questions. Who makes the decision? Who bears the cost if the decision is wrong? And who captures the benefit if it is right? If the same people who decide also personally pay the price of failure, they have a strong reason to stay cautious, to stay honest about limits, and to adapt quickly. If the costs of failure are pushed onto others, while the benefit of success is credited upward, you can get a pattern where bad plans persist longer than they should, because the feedback is muffled and the incentives reward looking confident rather than being correct. So the point of this slide is not to argue for a political slogan. It is to notice a structural difference between a system that learns through direct feedback and a system that struggles with information gaps, slower correction, and distorted responsibility. When we say smart hunting, it can sound like a compliment about clever tactics, but what I want you to take from this slide is something broader and honestly more humane. Smart hunting is rational allocation under scarcity. It is the skill of managing time, energy, risk, and responsibility in a world where waste is not a minor flaw, it is a threat. And here is the key moral twist. Efficiency does not have to mean cold calculation. In a survival setting, efficiency can be stewardship. It can be care for the group. It can be the difference between a plan that protects life and a plan that gambles with it. So if we step back and translate what we have been looking at, we can see a pattern. Reliable tools reduce failure risk. Selective prey choices balance payoff and danger. Transport decisions reduce unnecessary cost. Cooperation spreads risk. Diet flexibility expands options. Informal norms coordinate people without a command structure. And throughout it all, local knowledge and feedback guide decisions in ways that centralized direction struggles to match, because the world is too complex to compress into simple orders. Now, let me leave you with a few reflection questions that are not meant to preach, just to provoke curiosity. Where in modern life do we ignore local knowledge because it is messy or inconvenient? What incentives quietly reward waste or encourage decisions that push costs onto people who did not choose them? And what kinds of systems make resilience easier, not because they promise perfection, but because they allow quick learning and personal responsibility? The Neanderthals are not here to give us a political manifesto. They are here to remind us that human survival has always depended on agency, cooperation, and the ability to adapt through real feedback. If you enjoyed this kind of history, like the video, subscribe to Truth Behind History, and tell me in the comments, what is one modern system you think would improve if decisions were pushed closer to the people living with the consequences?